Hello, everyone. My name is John Morrone, and I will be your presenter today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this special event. Today's webinar is being co-sponsored by Frier Levitt and Physicians Reciprocal Insurers, and will focus on the benefits and pitfalls of telemedicine. Before we get started, I just want to note that all lines have been muted. Also, I want to remind you about the Questions tab on the right side of your screen. Go ahead and type in your questions throughout the webinar today. We will wait until the end of the presentation to answer those, but we'll be sure to get to all of them, whether it be during the live webinar or in an email to you following today's presentation. So just a little bit about our firm and myself. Frier Levitt is a national boutique healthcare firm focused purely on healthcare matters. We represent providers from solo physician practices to publicly traded companies. We have over 35 attorneys whose focus is purely on healthcare law, and we represent clients in regulatory and transactional matters, HIPAA, and the complete panoply of healthcare matters. I'm one of the partners at Frier Levitt. I've been in healthcare for over 35 years. My prior 20 years was on the executive side, holding positions at academic medical centers and within private and publicly traded companies. The material that's being presented today is for information only. This is not create a attorney-client relationship, but for information purposes only. Any need for legal services should be consulted with a competent licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. And of course, you can contact our firm if you need anything further after the presentation. So the first thing is, what is telemedicine? And telemedicine has a very broad definition and means a lot of things to a lot of different people. I actually like to use the term telehealth, which is a more encompassing definition. But typically, telemedicine or telehealth is a non-face-to-face clinical encounter, and that can include physician-patient encounters, mental health counseling, counseling from other types of providers, including nurse practitioners, pharmacists, etc. Telemedicine is also used in a variety of different platforms, and the laws governing that vary. There are some jurisdictions that allow for just single type of communication, which would be just the typical physician speaking to a patient on a telephone, or other jurisdictions require audio and video conferencing. There is also something called store and forward, where information is collected, stored, and then that information is sent over to the clinician for review and further analysis. Telemedicine can also include a variety of different remote patient monitoring practices. Now, many of these some have been around for many, many years. Things like Holter monitoring, pacemaker monitoring. Those are all considered forms of telemedicine. The patient is at home, the clinician is in a remote site, and information is transmitted over the internet or over telephone lines. And that technology continues to advance, where we now have things such as pain stimulators or nerve stimulators that can transmit information via Wi-Fi. You have pacemakers and defibrillators that are implantable devices that can also provide information to the clinician via Wi-Fi, via the internet, etc. But generally, what we will be focusing on today is how clinicians can provide services directly to patients in remote sites, basically substituting an in-office or emergency room encounter for this non-face-to-face encounter. Now, there are a variety of benefits to telemedicine, and from a public policy standpoint, there's been a lot that has come out from various stakeholders on the benefits of telemedicine and how it can support the healthcare system. First, it can first benefit of telemedicine is that it can be used to reach out to patients. Um, Physicians can accommodate more patients by being more efficient, less time bringing patients into an exam room, having patients waiting in a waiting room, not even having to have the actual, the physician be in the actual physical location. Physicians and patients can connect even when the physician is not in their office. Um, it is beneficial in avoiding urgent care visits, emergency room visits, and hopefully preventing um, the need for more advanced treatment by allowing patients earlier access to care. Because many patients are reluctant to go to the doctor or go to the emergency room until their symptoms become worse. This will allow the patient's convenience of contacting the physician at home and getting a more extensive encounter than just over the telephone. It can also benefit practitioners by increasing their patient base. We are, as a society, more and more technology driven. Um, Individuals entering the healthcare system, particularly millennials who are very comfortable with technology, um, are more likely to use and be comfortable accessing their physician or clinician via technology platform as opposed to their parents and grandparents who are more comfortable with the more traditional in-person physician encounter. But again, this will allow for earlier intervention of care and reduced cost in needing to go to an emergency department or go to um, an urgent care center. So, one of the significant differences of where we've transitioned into telehealth, as I mentioned earlier, for decades, people would call their physician on the phone, or on a weekend, someone has some type of symptoms or illness, and they call and get the physician's service, and then the physician would call back and give instructions over the phone. That is essentially a form of telemedicine. But up until very recently, that was not reimbursable, and it was just something that the physicians did as as a courtesy to patients or as part of their ongoing treatment. As telemedicine has gained greater adoption, many states are requiring payers to pay for telehealth encounter. So these laws are referred to as parity laws, and a typical parity law requires um, a health insurer to pay physicians or other practitioners in the same manner they would for a similar I'm sorry, not inpatient, a similar in-person encounter with the physician. So if the level of care provided via telemedicine would would equate to a level 3 office visit or a level 2 office visit, as the case may be, that the insurance company would be required to the um, pay the provider in the same manner at the same rate as they would for the in-office encounter. Um, some some payers though have new CPT codes specifically for telehealth encounters. So if you are getting involved in telemedicine or like to get involved in telemedicine, you need to be cognizant of learning how to appropriately bill and how to appropriately code for those encounters. One of the other areas to be considered kind of goes hand in hand with both reimbursement and the delivery of telehealth services is the definitions of where an encounter can occur. There are some limitations. So some payers will not pay unless the patient is in a appropriate originating site. So an appropriate originating site, for example, Medicare requires the patient to be in a healthcare facility, or New York State as well requires the patient to be in a healthcare facility as an originating site. So that limits the telehealth encounter a certain amount because then you can't see a patient or engage in an encounter with the patient at home or in a hotel room or out in public, where other states do not have those limitations. And the originating site can be anywhere. The patient, um, the patient could be in the park and twist their ankle and want to contact their physician via telehealth, or one of the commercial telehealth providers, the person doesn't already have a physician. So that's another area where you need to be cognizant in your particular jurisdiction. Another consideration for reimbursement and for the provision of telehealth care is that telehealth does not alter the standard of care, nor does it mitigate the responsibilities of the clinician in making their diagnosis or ordering medication or other services. So by that, we mean the following, is that if an appropriate diagnosis needs to have a blood pressure, EKG, pulse taken, temperature, whatever the case may be, if the standard of care requires certain vital signs to be collected, then that type of encounter is probably not appropriate for the telehealth visit. Merely because the physician is contacting the patient via telemedicine does not alter his or her duty to provide the same level of care that they would if the patient was in the office. So to give you some examples of how this would work in a clinical setting is that certain types of chief complaints or conditions lend themselves to audio video telehealth. For example, dermatological problems where um, the physician can elicit a history and view the affected site via telemedicine. Contrast that with something like a patient that has a complaint that one of the serious symptoms or signs may be an elevated blood pressure. Let's say a patient has onset of a very severe headache that may be indicative of some worse underlying condition. Well, then the physician would have to use their judgment and determine that this is not a diagnosis that can be made via telemedicine, and and advise the patient that they should either come into the office to be seen, go to a local emergency room or an urgent care center. So standard of care still applies even within telemedicine. Um, so let us move now to some of the regulatory concerns, and there are a great many. Uh, so I've mentioned some of them, and that is the first is how do you establish a bona fide physician-patient relationship? And state laws vary on that. One of the kind of landmark cases has been going on between Teladoc, which is a national provider of telemedicine services, and the Board of Medical Examiners in the state of Texas, where Texas's board passed a regulation that telehealth encounters could only be performed if the physician and patient had already established their relationship by an inpatient or an in-person encounter. That that particular case wound its way through the federal court systems, and ultimately the Texas legislature enacted a law that allowed the initial physician-patient relationship to be established via telemedicine. So each jurisdiction is different, and that's really the first part: is can we establish a physician-patient relationship via telemedicine? The other regulatory threshold is what type of platform can be used in the particular jurisdiction. Is it just audio? Is it audio and video? Is it store and forward? Can uh, can physician extenders or in different levels of clinician perform telehealth services in a particular jurisdiction? Same thing with location. Where is the patient located? What is the originating site? And all of those elements are state specific and need to be evaluated in your particular jurisdiction. Standard of care I touched upon a little bit earlier, in that really to not belabor the point, the touchstone of providing care via telehealth is that you need to provide the same level of care that you would be required to do in a face-to-face encounter. Um, so uh, states, some states don't even have laws on point, but have certain requirements that apply to all physicians. So, for example, in the state of New Jersey, which doesn't have a direct telemedicine law on point, requires physicians that are going to issue a prescription for a patient to be able um, that they have to be able to elicit an appropriate history and perform a physical exam sufficient to make a diagnosis appropriate for the ordering of the medication that they would be writing a prescription for. So again, that is a standard of care issue, and that's something that's regulated within the standards of practice and by the applicable licensing boards. Um, I just spoke a little bit about writing of prescriptions, as that requirement um, that I just spoke about was in the state of New Jersey, but many states, have varying requirements for the issuing of prescriptions. Virtually all jurisdictions do not allow for the prescribing of controlled substances via telehealth encounter. Again, that's something that um, needs to be verified if you are going to attempt to do that, or there is a need to order controlled substances via a telehealth encounter. And this is something that um, is this is an area that is evolving. Many jurisdictions across the country now, because of the opioid crisis, have restricted the first fill of a controlled substance for acute pain to some states have limits 5 days, some have a 7 day limit, some have a 10-day limit, and they will require a follow-up encounter before an additional prescription or refill can be granted. So here is an example of where telemedicine is really the ideal platform. Think of a surgeon provides a surgical procedure on a patient and sends the patient home with a 5-day prescription for an opiate. Now that patient continues to have pain. Here, the physician could um, evaluate the wound, get the history from the patient via telemedicine, and then extend the prescription if necessary. Again, that would require um, this to be allowed in that particular jurisdiction. One of the unfortunate aspects of regulatory healthcare law across the spectrum is that very often technology is far ahead of rules and statutes. So this is something that if you want to engage in this type of activity, um, it needs to be reviewed by competent legal counsel and provide guidance before entering into a situation where you're writing for controlled substances via a telehealth encounter. Um, one of the areas that we as a firm have been working for many years with telehealth providers and physicians and ancillary providers that utilize telehealth. One of the downfalls of telemedicine is that it has been used for somewhat nefarious purposes where um, marketing companies and other types of um, organizations that are trying to promote the sale of certain products that require prescriptions have used telemedicine as a platform to market to patients, where telemarketers will reach out to consumers and offer them products, whether that be topical pain creams, um, braces, diabetic testing supplies, really a very broad spectrum of products um, that require a physician's prescription. ED drugs, certain type of cosmetic treatments, all of the things that you will likely see, marketed um, by aggressive telemarketers at 2 a.m. So these companies have seized upon telemedicine and use it as a quick way to get a prescription from a physician. Now, one of the problems that has occurred, and the federal government, in the form of the Department of Justice, has taken on a number of cases, and we're involved in some of these cases and know about it firsthand, that these relationships violate a variety of different laws, including the federal anti-kickback statute, because the telemedicine company um, is paying the doctors directly for seeing the patient, which is kind of the quid pro quo is that the physician is getting paid by the telemedicine company and then writing a prescription to the pharmacy or the DME provider, who then takes some of the money that they receive from that prescription and pay the telemedicine company, which then pays the doctor. So you see that there is a closed loop of remuneration that goes from pharmacy to telemedicine company to the physician, and in return a prescription. So this is an area where if you are approached by any of these types of telemedicine companies or presented with any type of contract for this type of arrangement, it is something to be very wary of, because there have been, as I said, physicians, pharmacies, telemedicine companies that are under federal scrutiny for uh, for this inappropriate behavior. So it's something to be very wary of. Um, in um, in one case that we're involved in, where the telemedicine company um, obtained funds from a marketing company, and they used the telemedicine company or the telemedicine doctors as the vehicle to write prescriptions for Medicare beneficiaries. Medicare paid, in this case, for durable medical equipment. Um, Ultimately, um, the the individual that suffered the most was the physician, because the government, when looking at the durable medical equipment claims, looked at and compared that with the claims data from the physician and found that the physician that ordered the DME product did not submit a claim for an office encounter. So the investigators said, well, the doctor is writing all these prescriptions for durable medical equipment, but not submitting claims for having seen the patient. And ultimately, in this investigation, the Medicare administrative contractor and CMS revoked the physician's ability to bill Medicare beneficiaries. And revocation by Medicare is one of the simplest things for Medicare to do, and there's very little due process that a physician is entitled to. So we encountered a number of physicians who, thought that, well, I'm getting paid by the DME company. It's not a big deal. And for receiving, a pretty nominal amount of money, really ruined their medical practices because they could no longer bill Medicare fee for service or Medicare at all for their regular medical care. Medicare has some specific requirements for DME for telemedicine that everyone needs to be cognizant of. Now, some of these rules are changing to make it more accessible, but fundamentally, Medicare will only allow for telehealth encounters where the originating site is outside of a metropolitan statistical area or a rural health professional shortage area. Other than that, the encounter must be in the office of a physician or practitioner, a hospital, a critical access hospital, rural health clinic. You can see a variety of different healthcare facilities. Basically, Medicare, again, although their rules are supposed to be changing, it's not really meant to be a vehicle to be used at the patient's home, but rather when they're at a healthcare facility, unless they're in one of these outside the metropolitan statistical area or a rural health professional shortage area. So basically, areas that have limited access to clinicians, and this kind of goes to one of the areas of telemedicine that is truly beneficial to the healthcare system is that we have worked with providers that are providing specialty care to rural primary care centers where, a typical scenario is a patient is seen in a primary care center in a rural area. There's very limited access or no access at all to specialists. And the specialty consult is provided by a physician that can be hundreds of miles away. Now, the ideal scenario is that while the patient is with the primary care physician or in the primary care practice, that the primary care practice gets connected with a specialist, and the specialist does a consult via telehealth. In fact, I just read, I believe it was yesterday, that one of the incoming FCC commissioners is promoting telehealth and advocating for it in the rural setting. And the reason FCC is involved is that they're saying that there is a true need for expanded broadband and internet access in rural areas, because this will be one of the primary ways that patients will be able to get health care and greater access to health care in rural areas. So some of in Medicare, some of the distant site practitioners that can provide services are physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, nurse midwives, nurse specialists, CRNAs, clinical psychologists, social workers, etc. And just on that point, when we talk about mental health professionals, as you can imagine, or as logic dictates, mental health professionals and the provision of mental health care via telemedicine is really an ideal an ideal collaboration between the two services. Um, Although not exclusively, but generally, mental health professionals do not need direct patient access, do not necessarily always need to lay hands on the patient, and that these encounters can be done via telemedicine. Additionally, within mental health, we have found that telehealth also provides greater access to the patient. There's less of a stigma, patients not walking into a mental health clinic or a mental health practitioner's office. Um, Patients in areas that allow it can be more compliant with their visits uh, by doing the encounter from their own home. Patients with certain conditions uh, that prevent them from leaving home can now have greater access. So, really, mental health services are ideally suited for telehealth. So, I mentioned the invalidation of ancillary orders if there's no patient encounter. But one of the other conditions of payment is that it is an audio and video um, transmission, real-time communication between the distant site and the beneficiary. That's all we have for our presentation today, and I'll be happy to begin going through some of the questions. Okay, the first question. My employer wants to bill a 99411 for phone consults. Is that billable, or should we be using a different CPT code? Is there a specific CPT code used for phone consults that we are unaware of? He is an MD. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to depend on the jurisdiction, and it's going to depend on the payer of their specific requirements. So, assuming you're in a state that allows for just voice as a telehealth encounter, then and 99411 is the appropriate code for the specific patient's payer, then it would be. Um, the question really requires a little more detail into looking into what the appropriate code to use is and what is the requirement in the jurisdiction. But it is possible that that it may be the appropriate code. And again, if the state has a parity law, and that parity law would require payers to pay consistent with an office visit encounter, then the appropriate code may be, a 992 code. Um, the next question, it says, I'm licensed to practice in New York and Bangladesh. How do I serve my established patients from New Jersey? Okay, so that's a very important question. Is that generally, you have to be licensed in the jurisdiction that you are providing care. And now that's a general concept. There are specific situations in various states that will allow certain exceptions. Some states have an exception that says if you have a physician-patient relationship that was established in New York, for example, patient came to your office in New York, and you're seeing that patient, and now that patient is at home in New Jersey, can you provide a telemedicine encounter with that patient? Some states say yes, some say no. And specific to New York doesn't allow for a My interpretation of your question would be New York doesn't allow you to do telehealth encounter at the patient's home. So if the patient was at home in New York, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. So it's unlikely if you're a New York licensee um, contacting an established patient in New Jersey that's at their home in New Jersey. It's unlikely that that would be an appropriate visit under New York law. And again, there are some exceptions. There are some considerations. It may be, and I can't get into every nuance, but we have seen situations because we are in New York and New Jersey, and we represent clients across the country, but we have clients that have a situation very similar to you, but not only are they licensed in New York, but they're licensed in New Jersey as well. So conceptually, you would be um, evaluating the patient under your New Jersey license. Um, and I hope that provided a little bit of clarity to your question. Then the same listener asked, first time visit patient, registration and paperwork, how to process. Um, not really sure exactly the question, but I'm assuming that if the question is when you provide a telehealth encounter, what is what is necessary for you to get from the patient from a paperwork standpoint? And again, it would be the same type of information that you would have to get in the in an in office or face to face encounter. Now, many of the providers of telehealth platforms do this electronically. So things like the provision of patients' health insurance information, their demographics, um, their consent forms, their assignment of benefits, um, their HIPAA form, and their acknowledgement of receipt of notice of privacy practices can be done online, where the patient is essentially going to sign electronically for that. And that's one of the areas where, depending on who your technology provider is, um, will determine how you get that information and how it is stored. And just as I had mentioned earlier about the standard of care, your documentation via telehealth is equally important. It's the same as if you saw the patient in person. You're going to need to document the same as you would for a face-to-face encounter. The next question is, I am interested in offering consultations to foreign citizens in their countries via telemedicine. What regulatory issues may I encounter? Okay, so that um, is a difficult question to answer, and that is going to really depend on um, what the international laws are of you practicing medicine in the foreign country. So typically, the analysis that we perform is that whether it's state specific or country specific, anytime we cross borders, either state or country, is that where the patient is where the applicable laws lie. So if you are practicing in another country, you have to be, or our advice would be that you have to be licensed to do that in that country. Flipping it the other way is that if a physician was licensed and was a bona fide physician in a country in Europe or a country in Asia, um, we would find that if they were practicing medicine in New York via telemedicine, that they would be engaging in the unlicensed practice of law in the state of New York and in the United States. So my my opinion on this would be that you would need to um, check the laws of the country in which you are treating patients. Now, again, there are some exceptions and some practices that go on where a patient um, is a United States citizen or has established their physician-patient relationship in the United States and is treated on a regular basis by a physician in the United States, and then is traveling or goes back to their country of origin for some brief stay, and they have a medical problem, and their United States physician, provides a consult. That may or may not violate um, that country's licensing laws, but it's something that has to be evaluated before you go ahead and do it. Okay, the next question is, says Medicare, the two lists of must be, do we need to qualify under both or anything in that list? For example, if you are in a metro area but want to provide a telemedicine service to a patient in a skilled facility, Medicare will allow. Okay, I think what the question is that does the practitioner need to be um, in the requisite site? And the answer to that is no, is that it's where the patient is. So if the patient's in a medically underserved area and the physician is in New York City, that would still qualify under Medicare. It would kind of defeat the purpose if both the physician and the patient needed to be in a medically underserved area, because by definition, then it wouldn't be a medically underserved area anymore if the patient could get access to a specialist locally. The next question is, did I hear correctly? As a psychiatrist, if I do telepsych with a patient who has ADHD, for example, I'm not able to prescribe something like Adderall XR because it is a controlled substance. Um, it depends on the jurisdiction and depends on how the drug is scheduled. Is that it generally, it's not all controlled substances, but usually Schedule 2s that are not, that you cannot prescribe via telemedicine, and it's not in all circumstances. So it's going to be specific. It, the the bullet point in the presentation is that generally, the overwhelming majority of the time, things like opiates can't be prescribed as an initial dose via telemedicine. So a typical scenario would be where a patient is connected with a physician for the first time, and that physician would be attempting to order OxyContin for that patient or some other similar opiate that's a Schedule 2. Whether Adderall, which I'm not sure, I think it's a Schedule 3 or 4. I'm not really sure off the top of my head. But nonetheless, it's something that we would have to look into, but it's not a blanket for all controlled substances that can't be prescribed. The next question was, so what services can be billed for telemedicine in Essex County area? So I'm assuming that that's Essex County, New Jersey. New Jersey doesn't have a telemedicine law on point, so there's nothing under state law that either specifically allows it or specifically prevents it. But I would say that generally that you can engage in telemedicine in New Jersey, in Essex County. The only requirements that the DME has is that to prescribe medication to a patient, that the physician has to be able to make to take an appropriate history and physical exam of the patient, appropriate to develop the working diagnosis for whatever the medication is that they're prescribing. All right, so it's a standard of care issue, is that if a physician, just like in my opening, if a patient calls up on a Saturday night and says, I have a headache and a sore throat and a fever, and you do a history and you don't have any other risk factors, and you're comfortable as the independent clinical judgment of the physician to say, okay, I'm going to order you a Z-Pack and provide the patient with follow-up instructions, to come to the office or go to the ER if their symptoms um, don't change in a positive way within a certain period of time. That's the typical scenario that would be allowed in New Jersey. You just have to be able to support the diagnosis and the treatment by the information that you can achieve over the phone or over audio and video. The next question is liability for missing suicidal thinking in mental health and telemedicine versus sitting face to face. So all liability or most liability in med mal turns again on the standard of care, and if there is substantively something that would make a difference by seeing a patient face to face. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not an expert on mental health, but if there was something that was crucial to seeing the patient and physically being there with the patient, it could be alleged that there was a deviation from the standard of care. That is just a a med mal legal standard that would require an expert to be able to say, oh, this patient it had the psychiatrist or had the mental health professional seen the patient face to face, they would have seen this, or this that would have changed the diagnosis and the treatment. I think it's unlikely, but that's what would have to occur. The next question is, how about palliative care goals of care discussions via telehealth? I'm not really sure what the question is. Is that I'm guessing that can palliative care goals be discussed via telehealth and then be reimbursable? That I don't know what the requirements are for palliative care, but if the services that are being provided would be reimbursable by the insurance company, if it was done face to face with the patient, then if it's done via telemedicine in a jurisdiction that has parity laws, it would be reimbursable as well. The next question is, can I engage in a telemedicine encounter for pediatric neurology cognitive assessment international, and what is the malpractice liability? So I guess this is a combination of some of the other questions that were asked, is that when you say internationally, it would depend on the jurisdiction, the country of origin, and whether you're licensed there and what that country's laws are. Because even though you're using technology, I think that you may be violating another country's law. Now, as far as the liability is concerned, both from a civil liability or criminal liability standpoint, the it's really going to depend on whether the other country has the ability to reach you. On the civil side, I think there would be more of a risk that someone, if you did something wrong, they could sue you in the United States and say you were engaging in some type of inappropriate activity that resulted in a harm, a typical tort claim. So, and another consideration is that um, if it is swept within the realm of medical malpractice, would your malpractice carrier cover you for that? And that's something that certainly before you would engage in any type of activity like that, I would speak with um, your med mal carrier. Um, the next question is, I have been approached by several telepsych companies wanting to hire me. How do I assess what they are offering? Is it legit? Um, what I would ask anybody that's approaching you, I'm assuming that you're a clinician and they're approaching you to provide some type of services, is tell them that you would like to see a letter of intent or or a term sheet or some other narrative of what it is that they want you to do, what their company profile is, and how reimbursement would flow. Are they going to bill on questions like, do they want to bill under your MPI number? Are they going to charge the patient and then pay you? Is there a question of them engaging in the unlicensed practice if they're billing patients? Because only licensees can bill patients. So there are a whole number of questions to ask. Or additionally, you should say, okay, give me the contract, provide me with the contract, and let me have it reviewed by an attorney. And anything that you do should be reviewed by a competent healthcare attorney to make sure that uh, that the companies or the individuals that you're getting involved with are not going to create a situation that is either going to endanger you civilly or criminally or affect your license. It says, the next question is, in New York, does this mean I cannot do teleconference just to review results with the patient over the phone? That is a very good question. And unfortunately, right now, that New York is kind of in a netherworld. The telemedicine laws don't really change um, what has been going on or shouldn't really change what's going on. As I said in the opening, is that telemedicine or non-face-to-face encounters have been going on for as long as there have been telephones. So what we're talking about in telemedicine is that when you and this is where laws kind of intersect and get a little bit dicey. What we're talking about really in telemedicine is being able um, to bill for a specific encounter, and that's really what distinguishes telemedicine or the term telemedicine now with other non-face-to-face encounters. Is it essentially what you've always done when you're reviewing um, results over the phone with a patient? That's really part of your existing face-to-face encounter. I mean, that's the way it's looked at from a reimbursement standpoint. Patient comes to your office, you do an evaluation of the patient, you bill an E&M code for your office visit, and as part of that E&M code, as you're coding it, one of the criteria is like lab studies and evaluation and review. And doing that over the phone with the patient is perfectly acceptable. Is that you just don't get an additional compensation for it. So it's not one of the true kind of telehealth encounters that we're talking about now. You can still always speak to your patient on the phone, review lab results over the phone, provide them with results from imaging studies over the phone, but those are not reimbursable. Now, where it gets a little bit just to make things a little muddier for everybody is that Medicare has certain programs like chronic care management, which is a reimbursed non-face-to-face encounter, but is not really considered telemedicine for for Medicare's purposes. So they pay the physician for a 20-minute non-face-to-face encounter to do a chronic care management evaluation, the 20-minute non-face-to-face with a patient. So there are circumstances where you can do certain encounters and get paid outside of the usual telemedicine laws. So as you can see, there are a lot of different laws that cross-sect and can create confusion. The next question is, I practice in New York. Can encounter be with a patient who is on vacation abroad and and if provider on vacation and patient at his home in New York? Okay, so I guess this question is something that I spoke about kind of a little bit earlier. So one scenario is the clinician is in New York and the patient is on vacation in another state or in another country. Can the physician provide a consult? And again, that's another one of those gray areas where it's been done long before telemedicine was even a term. Is it something that's going to get you in trouble? Not likely. Um, Same thing the other way around is that if the physician is on vacation in Spain and the patient's home in New York, um, then that's probably not an issue either. All of these things are going to be fact specific. Where it would be distinguishable and where people have gotten in trouble is that if you're a New York physician and you're sitting in an office in New York and you're doing 100 consults a day with patients all across Europe, yeah, you probably will get in trouble. And we have seen this, and physicians have been prosecuted for this, is that the physician is licensed in New York and is engaging in telehealth encounters all over the country and writing prescriptions, 100, 120 prescriptions a day for patients in 20 different states. And that's not an exaggeration. That is from a real case. So these are, as I said, these are fact specific. So there is a certain amount of reasonableness to this. And even though that these things occur sometimes in gray areas, we have a lot of these questions come up. We represent a lot of clients in Florida, and a lot of pharmacies in Florida, and the question comes up all the time is like, well, what happens? In the end of December, beginning of January, I get all these prescriptions from New York doctors for patients whose address is in New York. Am I going to get in trouble for doing this? And that's just, what is occurring is not telemedicine, is not a inappropriate physician-patient relationship. It's patients established their physician-patient relationship in New York and then fly south for the winter. And so there's no real law governing it, but it's not something that people generally get in trouble for. And last question says, if we meet the criteria for telemed visit in New York, do we just submit the regular code for an in-person visit, but just to include the telemedicine GT modifier? Yes, and the answer to that is yes, is that if you meet all the criteria for a telemedicine encounter, just submit the appropriate code with the modifier. Okay, it looks like we've run out of time, so we will conclude today's webinar. If you have any questions that weren't answered, or if you would like someone from our team to contact you, please reach out to us using the contact methods you see on the screen now. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and on behalf of all of us here at Frier Levitt and PRI, thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.